On the clay courts of Rome, the greatest player in history just looked at a 23-year-old prodigy and diagnosed exactly how he is destroying his own career. And it has absolutely nothing to do with medical tape. The coverage surrounding Carlos Alcaraz over the past several days has been completely consumed by a singular, obsessive focus. Nobody is talking about the fundamental structural flaw hidden beneath the daily injury reports. The tennis establishment is entirely occupied with analyzing biomechanics, dissecting tournament schedules, and mourning the apparent fragility of a generational talent. The prevailing assumption across the sport is that we are witnessing a physical tragedy unfolding in real time. To understand the absolute gravity of this misdiagnosis, we have to look at the suffocating atmosphere of the Rome Masters Media Day on the 7th of May 2026. Inside the press complex at the Foro Italico, the tension was palpable. The Spanish press contingent arrived armed with a distinct, overwhelmingly pessimistic narrative. Following Alcaraz's alarming physical deterioration during the Mutua Madrid Open, a tournament where his heavily strapped right forearm became the dominant, inescapable image of the entire week, the questions presented to the rest of the locker room were universally bleak. The media demanded answers about the brutality of the ATP calendar. They questioned whether the heavy, grinding nature of European red dirt is fundamentally incompatible with the explosive torque generated by the modern forehand. The record undeniably shows a terrifying timeline of physical breakdowns right as the clay court season reaches its peak intensity. The sudden withdrawals, the grimaces between points, the desperate mid-match consultations with the physiotherapist, they all seem to point to an inescapable biological reality. The universally accepted understanding is that the physical vessel of Carlos Alcaraz is simply too fragile to withstand the crushing demands of his own baseline power. The medical tape is treated as empirical evidence of a body actively betraying its owner. It is an explanation that provides comfort, primarily because it implies that the problem is a tragic stroke of biomechanical bad luck. The narrative suggests that if only the clay were faster, or if only the balls were lighter, the Spanish prodigy would be entirely fine. That is a comforting illusion. Because when the barrage of questions regarding Alcaraz's physical fragility was finally directed at Novak Djokovic, the dynamic of the entire conversation shifted. Djokovic is not merely a peer in the locker room. He is the undisputed sovereign of survival. He is a player who has spent 2 decades turning physical preservation and the meticulous distribution of energy into a dark, impenetrable art. Djokovic understands better than anyone alive that winning multiple Grand Slams in your late 30s is not an accident of genetics, but the result of a ruthless, highly calculated system of self-governance. When he was asked by a Spanish journalist to comment on the devastating physical toll of the clay season and the tragic vulnerability of his young rival, the room expected sympathy. They expected the Serbian legend to offer predictable platitudes about the grueling calendar and wish Alcaraz a speedy recovery. They expected him to validate the narrative of the medical tape. He did exactly the opposite. He dismissed the physical diagnosis entirely. The popular reading of the current crisis is that Carlos Alcaraz is structurally compromised, a brilliant shooting star burning out under the friction of the tour. But Djokovic looked straight past the heavily strapped right arm and identified an entirely different disease. He identified a catastrophic failure in pacing. Where the tennis world sees a tragic victim of biomechanical breakdown, the greatest player in history sees a profound, almost dangerous level of tactical immaturity. The fundamental problem sitting at the core of the Alcaraz project is not that the tendons are weak, but that the engine is constantly being redlined in moments that require nothing more than a steady cruise. It is the catastrophic difference between respecting the grueling, month-long architecture of a marathon and treating every single baseline exchange in an early round match like a desperate sprint for survival. To fully grasp the weight of this assessment, you have to understand the specific authority of the source. Novak Djokovic did not accumulate 24 Grand Slam titles simply by possessing superior baseline mechanics. He built his historical empire on a meticulous, almost surgical understanding of human endurance. He is the ultimate architect of longevity. When Djokovic observes a young player struggling on the professional tour, he is not looking at grip sizes, racket string tension, or the brand of medical tape being utilized. He is looking at the internal speedometer. So, when the microphone was pushed toward him on that Thursday afternoon, and he was asked to evaluate the physical tragedy of Carlos Alcaraz, Djokovic paused for 3 full seconds. The room went silent. Then, Speaking with the cold detachment of a man who has survived the exact crucible Alcaraz is currently burning in, Djokovic offered a completely different diagnosis. Everyone is looking at the medical tape, Djokovic said. But the clay does not break your muscles. It breaks your patience. He is trying to win Roland Garros in May. That is not a sympathetic comment about a young player's unfortunate luck with injuries. That is a devastating indictment of his tactical maturity. What the Serbian legend identified in just 4 sentences is the exact mechanism that is destroying the Spanish phenomenon from the inside out. The medical tape on the right forearm is not the disease, it is merely the symptom of a mind that fundamentally refuses to slow down. The concept of patience on a clay court is not simply about waiting for the ball to bounce. It is about emotional regulation. It is the quiet understanding that a second-round match against an unseeded qualifier in Madrid or Rome does not require the same physiological output as a Grand Slam final. But Alcaraz, trapped by his own explosive identity, does not know how to dial back the engine. He approaches every single baseline exchange as if the entire tournament depends on hitting a highlight reel winner. Red dirt is a surface specifically designed to absorb power. It neutralizes the explosive, single-shot winners that Alcaraz relies on to shorten points. To win consistently on this surface, a player must accept the grueling geometry of long rallies. They must accept that points will be ugly, grinding, and exhausting. Djokovic mastered this decades ago. He learned how to win matches while operating at a controlled 60% of his maximum capacity, ruthlessly preserving his physical capital for the second week of a major. Alcaraz, however, views operating at 60% as a betrayal of his brand. When the clay absorbs his first heavy forehand, his immediate instinct is not to construct the point with patience, but to hit the second forehand even harder. This creates an unsustainable, violent torque on the wrist and forearm. This is the invisible flaw. He is turning every routine match into a desperate sprint, completely ignoring the structural reality that the European clay swing is a grueling, 2-month marathon. The clay does not forgive the impatient. By trying to summon the emotional and physical intensity required to win Roland Garros during the early rounds of May Masters events, Alcaraz is effectively redlining his body until the internal circuitry simply melts. The forearm is not inherently weak. It is just being violently overworked by a player who has not yet learned the dark art of pacing. He is sprinting a marathon. When a 24-time Grand Slam champion offers a philosophical diagnosis regarding patience and emotional regulation, it requires a distinct kind of tactical expert to translate that philosophy into a tangible, mechanical verdict. Paul Annacone is uniquely positioned to understand the architecture of a historic tennis season, having coached both Pete Sampras and Roger Federer during their absolute primes. Annacone understands that the primary job of an elite team is not necessarily to improve a player's forehand, but to manage their physical capital over an 11-month calendar. Speaking on Tennis Channel Live shortly after Djokovic's press conference concluded, Annacone provided the exact tactical translation of the Serbian's warning. He stated, "Novak is basically saying Carlos is sprinting in a marathon. The physical injury is just a symptom of a tactical immaturity." To truly understand the terrifying reality of what Annacone and Djokovic are seeing, we have to look past the highlight reels and examine the raw ATP data regarding time on court and baseline intensity. If you analyze the historical performance metrics of the Big Three, specifically Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic when they were 23 years old, a fascinating pattern emerges in how they navigated the early rounds of Masters 1000 events. When facing unseeded qualifiers or players ranked well outside the top 50 in places like Madrid or Rome, Federer and Djokovic treated those matches as glorified practice sessions. Their average time on court in the first 2 rounds routinely hovered between 70 and 85 minutes. More importantly, they achieved this by actively refusing to redline their engines. They operated at a highly controlled, incredibly disciplined 60% of their maximum capacity. They were perfectly willing to lose a few games, to hit safe, looping balls to the middle of the court, and to win utterly forgettable, ugly matches. They understood the basic mathematics of survival. You cannot spend premium physical currency on a Tuesday if you want to lift a trophy on a Sunday. Now, look at the exact same data set for Carlos Alcaraz. The contrast is genuinely alarming. The secret revelation hidden inside his medical reports is that Alcaraz fundamentally does not know how to operate at 60%. When he steps onto the dirt against the world number 85 in a second-round match, The internal speedometer immediately spikes to maximum capacity. His average time on court in early round victories frequently bleeds past the 2-hour mark. But it is not just the duration of the matches. It is the violent intensity of the execution. Alcaraz is generating maximum torque on every single forehand. He is sprinting into the outer alleys to retrieve impossible drop shots that a veteran would simply let bounce twice. He is manufacturing breathtaking, physically taxing highlight reel points in moments that absolutely do not require them. This is not a demonstration of superior dedication. This is a profound failure of pacing. When you swing at 100% intensity for 2.5 hours against an opponent you could have systematically dismantled at 60%, you are writing a physical check that your tendons eventually have to cash. The human arm is simply not designed to withstand the violent friction of modern clay court tennis without intermittent periods of conservation. Anacone recognized exactly what Djokovic recognized. The tape on the right forearm is not a tragic anomaly. It is the guaranteed biological outcome of treating every single baseline exchange like a desperate, life-or-death sprint. Alcaraz is bleeding premium physical capital in the opening miles of the European clay swing, completely ignoring the terrifying reality that the marathon has barely even begun. I want to be honest about the limits of this argument. When you analyze a 23-year-old athlete through the cold, unforgiving lens of historical data and tactical pacing, it is very easy to dismiss his entire methodology as simply naive. The generous reading of this situation is that this unbridled, 100% intensity is exactly what makes Carlos Alcaraz the most electric phenomenon in modern sports. You cannot entirely separate the breathtaking, highlight reel genius on the court from the explosive, obsessive engine that drives it. Alcaraz has been burdened with an impossible identity from the moment he won his first title. He is the designated savior of the ATP Tour, the smiling heir to Rafael Nadal, and the ultimate showman. He operates under the assumption that the crowd paid good money to see magic, and giving them a highly controlled, incredibly boring 60% effort feels like a fundamental betrayal of his own brand. He is physically incapable of hitting a safe, looping ball to the middle of the court when the crowd is chanting his name, because his identity demands a spectacular winner down the line. He does not want to cheat the fans. He does not want to win ugly. He wants to win beautifully every single time he steps onto the dirt. But there is a less generous reading. The less generous reading, which aligns perfectly with what Novak Djokovic identified during that press conference in Rome, is that this desperate need to entertain is actively shortening his career. The brutal reality of the ATP calendar is that it does not reward aesthetic beauty, it rewards survival. Both readings might be true at once. There is a completely valid version of this story, where the relentless sprinting makes him the most beloved player of his generation, secures the largest endorsement contracts in the world, and cements his status as a global icon. It is entirely possible that his high-intensity style is simply the necessary cost of his specific brand of genius. But history is a ruthless judge. The clay courts of Europe do not care about how many viral clips you generated in the early rounds of a Masters 1000 event. The red dirt does not care about your emotional commitment to entertaining the Spanish public. When you arrive at the quarterfinals of a Grand Slam, carrying the cumulative physical fatigue of a dozen unnecessary, violent sprints, the body simply demands the bill. The ultimate authorities of the sport, players like Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, understood a fundamental truth that the 2-3-year-old Spaniard is still fighting against. Greatness is not measured by how spectacular you look while destroying an unseeded qualifier on a Tuesday afternoon in Madrid. Greatness is measured by whether your legs still function and your right arm is still intact on the second Sunday of a major. Alcaraz is currently choosing the immediate gratification of the sprint over the grueling delayed reward of the marathon. And until he accepts that true tactical mastery requires the humility to play at 60%, the medical tape will remain a permanent fixture on his arm. This brings us to the immediate, terrifying reality of the upcoming weeks. We are standing on the edge of the Rome Masters, with Roland Garros looming like a giant shadow over the entire calendar. My prediction is this, and I am going to commit to it. If Carlos Alcaraz cannot learn the dark art of pacing, if he fundamentally refuses to win ugly with just 60% of its engine during the early rounds of these Masters events, his physical vessel will not survive the grueling architecture of Paris. He might create the most breathtaking highlight reels of the European clay swing, but he will not be standing on court Philippe Chatrier on the final Sunday. The body cannot sustain a marathon when the mind insists on sprinting every single mile. Novak Djokovic, the ultimate architect of longevity, just handed the Alcaraz camp the explicit blueprint for historical survival. He completely dismissed the convenient narrative of bad medical luck and offered a chilling diagnosis of tactical immaturity. The question that sits underneath this entire crisis is no longer whether Carlos has the talent to dominate the sport. The question is whether he and his coaching staff possess the profound humility required to listen to a legend, completely rebuild his internal speedometer, and learn how to finally slow down. This channel holds the belief that true greatness requires the discipline of patience, but I want to know where you stand. Tell me in the comments what you actually think. Is Carlos Alcaraz tactically immature for refusing to pace himself? Or is his relentless, high-intensity style simply the necessary cost of his specific brand of genius? Come back to this video when Roland Garros begins, because everything we have discussed today will either look prescient or look like overcautious noise. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The most interesting takes always end up at the top, so get in there. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.